The neon lights of Zeta Prime flickered against the darkness of space, casting long, jagged shadows through the station's grimy walkways. This was not a place for the weak. It was a city of the desperate, the ruthless, and those willing to make any deal to survive. Jake Carter had made his share of bad deals, but this one might be his worst. He stood in the private chamber of Sarn the Collector, the massive reptilian crime lord who owned half the station and all of its gambling pits. The room smelled of burning incense and something faintly metallic, a scent that clung to the back of Jake's throat like a bad omen. Sarn lounged in his throne-like chair, his scaled fingers tapping lazily on the armrest as he regarded Jake with amusement. "You lost." Sarn's voice was slow, deliberate, each syllable weighed down with the certainty of power. Jake swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep eye contact. He'd been playing high-stakes sabacc, hoping to double what little credits he had left. Instead, he'd lost his ship, his only means of staying independent in a galaxy that swallowed men whole. Sarn leaned forward, his yellow, slit-pupilled eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You owe me, human, and I do not deal in mercy." Jake exhaled, already feeling the noose tightening around his neck. "Look, give me a few days. I can." Sarn's deep chuckle sent a chill through him. "A few days." He clicked his sharp teeth together in amusement. "You had one ship, one pathetic ship. That's gone. Tell me, what exactly do you have left to bargain with?" Silence. Jake clenched his fists, running through every possible escape in his mind. None of them ended well. Then Sarn gestured toward the darkened corner of the room. A figure stepped forward, draped in a long, hooded cloak. Even in the dim light, Jake could make out the graceful, fluid movement of someone who did not belong in a place like this. "Your debt is forgiven," Sarn said smoothly, "if you take her." Jake's brow furrowed. He glanced between the hooded figure and the crime lord. "What?" "She is yours now," Sarn continued, enjoying his confusion. "Your property. A servant, if you will." Jake stiffened. The entire station was filled with traders, smugglers, and criminals, but slavery was still illegal in most systems. Even the dirtiest merchants avoided it, if only because it was more trouble than it was worth. "I don't do that," Jake said coldly. Sarn sighed, shaking his massive head. "How human of you." He waved a clawed hand. "She is no ordinary servant. Consider her payment for your debt, or I can have you gutted and sold for parts. Your choice." Jake's jaw tightened. He stared at the figure, trying to make out anything beneath the cloak. No words, no movement, nothing. Whoever she was, she didn't resist. Sarn grinned, flashing too many teeth. "Ah, now you understand. Take her. Leave. The debt is paid." Jake hesitated, but there was no choice here. Sarn wasn't a man who bluffed. He was still alive because he was calculating, always ensuring the deal benefited him. That meant there was more to this than Jake could see. With a slow nod, he exhaled and gestured for the hooded figure to follow. She moved without hesitation, her steps almost too silent. As they left the chamber, the last thing Jake heard was Karn's low chuckle. "Let's see how long you survive, human." Jake didn't look back. But something told him he'd just made a very, very big mistake. Jake led the hooded figure through the dimly lit corridors of Zeta Prime, his mind racing with questions. The air smelled of burnt circuitry and recycled oxygen, the usual stench of a space station that never truly slept. His boots echoed against the metal grates, but the woman, if she even was a woman, moved like a ghost. No sound, no hesitation. He glanced over his shoulder. She followed at a steady pace, her face completely hidden beneath the heavy cloak. She had said nothing since Sarn handed her over, and that silence made Jake uneasy. This was wrong. He had spent years in the darker corners of the galaxy, dealing with smugglers, con artists, and outlaws, but this felt different. Sarn had practically given her away. Why? If she was truly a servant, Why was a crime lord willing to wipe out a massive debt just to get rid of her? Jake's gut told him this was a trap. He just didn't know what kind yet. Reaching Dock 17, he keyed in his access code, and the airlock hissed open. His ship, the Vagabond, wasn't anything special, just a battered old freighter barely holding together. But it was home. "All right," he muttered, stepping inside. "Let's get something straight." The woman stepped in after him, the automatic door sliding shut with a quiet hiss. The moment the seal engaged, Jake turned to face her. "Who are you?" he demanded. No answer. "Why did Sarn give you to me?" Still nothing. He exhaled sharply. "Look, I don't know what kind of game is being played here, but I don't own people. If you want to leave, the door's right there." For the first time, she reacted. A slight tilt of her head, as if she were studying him. Then she reached up and slowly lowered her hood. Jake's breath caught. She wasn't just any alien. Her skin was a deep shade of sapphire blue, smooth and flawless, with delicate silver markings running across her cheekbones. Her eyes, large, luminescent, and an unnatural shade of violet, watched him with unnerving calm. Her features were sharp, symmetrical, almost too perfect. Jake had seen plenty of species, but he knew exactly what she was. Velorian. And that changed everything. Velorians weren't servants. They weren't even common. They were one of the wealthiest and most advanced races in the known galaxy, their empire stretching across entire star systems. The only way Xarn could have had a Velorian in his possession was if something had gone horribly wrong. Jake took a cautious step back. "You're not a maid." A flicker of amusement passed through her eyes, so brief he almost missed it. "No," she finally said. Her voice was smooth, cultured, and calm, with the slight lilt of someone accustomed to power. "I am not." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Then what the hell are you doing here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past him, her eyes scanning the ship with quiet interest. Everything about her, the way she moved, the way she carried herself, told him she was used to commanding rooms, not being passed around as property. Jake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Xarn said you were payment for my debt. That's a load of crap, isn't it?" The woman turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "Would you have accepted if he told you the truth?" Jake narrowed his eyes. "Try me." She studied him again, as if deciding whether he was worth telling. Then, after a moment, she simply said, "My name is Seyla." Just that. No explanation, no context. Jake waited, but nothing else came. "Okay," he said slowly. "Seyla, why did Xarn want you gone so badly?" For the first time, a hint of tension crossed her features. It was slight, so slight that someone who didn't know how to read people would have missed it. But Jake wasn't just anyone. "He fears what will happen if I remain in his possession," she said finally. That wasn't much of an answer, but it was enough to confirm what Jake already suspected. She was important, very important. And if Xarn had given her away so easily, it meant someone dangerous was looking for her. Jake exhaled sharply. "Let me guess. You have enemies." Seyla's lips curled into a faint smile. "Don't we all?" That was not a good answer. Jake could feel the weight of this situation settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't just some bad deal. This was a problem. If Seyla was being hunted, and Xarn had just dumped her on him, it meant that now he was a target too. Damn it. Jake ran a hand through his hair. "Listen, I don't know what kind of mess you're in, but I don't need another enemy. So if you've got people coming after you, I suggest you." The ship's alarm suddenly blared, cutting him off. Jake spun toward the control panel, heart pounding. "Incoming hostile SIGNL, DTHTED." Seyla's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes, something that looked an awful lot like expectation. Jake's gut twisted. "Tell me that's a coincidence." She tilted her head. "It isn't." "Damn it. Damn it. Damn it. Jake rushed to the cockpit and pulled up the scanner feed. 3 ships, all unmarked, heading straight for the Vagabond. He turned back to Seyla, his pulse hammering. Who the hell did you piss off? Seyla met his gaze without hesitation. The kind of people who don't leave loose ends. Jake swore under his breath. He should have walked away. But it was far too late for that now. The alarm continued to blare through the Vagabond as Jake's fingers flew over the control panel, pulling up a full scan of the incoming ships. The screen flickered, revealing 3 sleek, high-speed vessels, their weapons already primed. Unmarked, but that didn't mean anything. Anyone with half a brain could tell these weren't friendly traders stopping by for a chat. His gut clenched. Whoever they were, they'd found them fast. Jake shot a glare at Seyla, who stood perfectly still, watching the screen with unreadable eyes. You want to tell me who these guys are? Kill teams, she said without a hint of emotion. Sent to eliminate me before word of my survival spreads. Jake felt his stomach drop. Great. And I assume now I'm part of the problem. She turned to face him, her violet eyes sharp and assessing. Yes, he swore under his breath, shoving himself into the pilot's seat and firing up the ship's engines. The Vagabond rumbled as the thrusters powered up, the ship coming alive beneath his hands. All right, princess. Don't call me that. He shot her a look, but there was no time to argue. Fine, Seyla. You got any tricks up your sleeve, or am I just supposed to outrun assassins with a ship that barely holds together on a good day? She moved smoothly beside him, glancing at the controls, engaged the secondary thrusters and angle 43 degrees starboard. There's a maintenance tunnel beneath Dock 17. It should buy us a few seconds. Jake frowned. How the hell do you? The lead ship fired. A blazing plasma round ripped past them, slamming into the docking bay walls. The entire station shuddered from the impact, and Jake didn't need any more convincing. He yanked the controls hard to the right, following her instructions, and the Vagabond lurched forward, skimming just beneath the narrow tunnel she had mentioned. The ship shuddered as they barely cleared the exit, streaking away from Zeta Prime at top speed. Jake gritted his teeth. That tunnel wasn't on any schematics I've seen. Seyla didn't look at him, because it was built in secret. He stared at her for half a second before turning his focus back to flying. I knew you were trouble. The comms panel crackled to life, and a voice filled the cockpit. It was cold, professional, completely devoid of emotion. Unidentified freighter, you are harboring a high-value target. Surrender her now, and you will not be harmed. Jake let out a humorless laugh. Yeah, I'm sure that's how this goes. He switched off the comms. Nope, not happening. The moment he killed the signal, the ships accelerated. Bright red targeting markers appeared on the scanner, locking onto the Vagabond. The first ship broke formation, peeling off to their left in an attempt to flank them, while the other 2 pressed forward. Jake's grip tightened on the controls. Hold on. The ship veered sharply, twisting through the debris field outside Zeta Prime. Chunks of metal and abandoned wreckage floated in the void, remnants of past battles and failed smuggling runs. Jake wove through them with practiced ease, but the kill teams weren't amateurs. They're gaining, Seyla observed calmly. Jake scowled. Yeah, I noticed. The targeting alarms blared again. The moment he saw the telltale glow of a missile launch, he slammed the thrusters, pushing the ship into a dangerous corkscrew dive. The missile streaked past, barely missing them before exploding against a drifting freighter wreck. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, Jake growled. I don't even know what you did, but I am not dying for it. Seyla remained unnervingly calm, her hands resting on the co-pilot's console, as if she was simply waiting. Then, in a voice far too composed for someone being hunted, she said, If you get me out of here, I can make you rich. Jake snorted. Rich? Lady, I don't even know if we'll be alive in the next 3 minutes. Then focus, she said coolly. Because if you hesitate, we won't make it that far. Another plasma round sizzled past, scorching the ship's left wing. The energy shield flickered, and a red warning light flared to life. "Shields at 20%, Jake muttered, jaw tightening. Fantastic. A new alarm blared, and his stomach sank. The lead ship was preparing a tractor beam. If that locked on, they were done. He'd seen enough bounty hunters operate to know how this ended. First came the tractor beam, then the boarding party, then a bullet to the head. Seyla finally moved. In a blur of motion, she slid into the co-pilot's seat, her hands flying across the console with practiced efficiency. Jake's eyes widened. "What the hell are you?" Before he could finish, the vagabond's thrusters flared to full power, launching them into a sudden high-speed roll. The force slammed Jake back into his seat, and the tractor beam missed by inches. The comms crackled again, this time with something close to irritation. "You cannot escape. Surrender her now." Seyla didn't look up. "Override the safeties on your hyperdrive." Jake gaped at her. "That'll fry the core." "Not if you do it right," she said, flicking through ship diagnostics. "I assume you're competent." He stared at her, torn between frustration and disbelief. Then, shaking his head, he muttered, "If this kills us, I'm haunting you." With a quick sequence of inputs, he bypassed the hyperdrive safety locks. The console screamed warnings at him, but he ignored them. "Coordinates," he snapped. Seyla's eyes flicked over the star chart. A dust cloud near Orion's maw. It will disrupt their tracking. Jake had no idea how she knew all this, but now was not the time to ask. The enemy ships were closing in, their weapons charging for a final strike. The tractor beam fired again. This time, it locked onto their rear thrusters. "Now or never, Carter," Seyla shouted. Jake hit the hyperdrive. For a split second, the ship resisted, like it was fighting against the pull of the tractor beam. Then, with a shuddering lurch, the vagabond ripped free. The stars stretched into long, glowing lines as they entered hyperspace, vanishing into the void. Silence. The alarms quieted, and the tension in the cockpit finally settled. Jake let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand down his face. That was way too close. Seyla exhaled, but she was far calmer. "You handled it well." Jake glanced at her. "Yeah, well, next time I'd like a heads up before we piss off an entire kill squad." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You saved us." Jake sighed, leaning back. "Yeah, and now I really need a drink." Seyla didn't laugh, didn't smile. Instead, she looked out at the swirling hyperspace tunnel ahead of them, her expression shifting slightly. Because she knew something Jake didn't. This was only the beginning. The hum of the vagabond's hyperdrive filled the cabin, a steady vibration beneath Jake's boots as the ship streaked through the blue haze of hyperspace. He sat in the pilot's chair, arms crossed, staring at the woman across from him. Seyla, the so-called Maid who had turned out to be something else entirely. Jake had met all kinds of people in his travels: smugglers, pirates, bounty hunters, corrupt officials. But Seyla was different. Too calm, too calculating, too important. He let the silence stretch between them, waiting for her to say something. But she didn't. She just sat there, composed, her violet eyes fixed on the swirling tunnel of hyperspace beyond the viewport. Jake sighed, rubbing his temple. "All right. We're alive. Barely. Mind telling me what the hell is going on now?" Seyla finally turned to him. "I told you. I have enemies." Jake scoffed. "Yeah, no kidding. And I'm guessing those weren't just some random thugs back there. They were professional assassins," she said smoothly, "sent to ensure I never leave Zeta Prime alive." Jake leaned forward. "Yeah. And why's that?" "Because Karn was feeling generous. Because he just happened to wipe out my debt and drop you in my lap out of the kindness of his cold-blooded heart." He shook his head. "No. That doesn't track. He was getting rid of you. He wanted you off his hands before something worse came looking." So, what are you, Seyla? Who did you piss off? She was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she leaned back in her seat. My full name is Seyla Vey'Rath Velorian, she said, firstborn heir to House Velorian, daughter of Lord Tyrann Velorian, and the rightful successor to one of the wealthiest empires in the galaxy. Jake blinked. Then he let out a breathy laugh. Nope, not buying it. He shook his head. You're telling me you're a billionaire heiress? That I've got the equivalent of royalty sitting on my ship? Nah, no way. She met his gaze without flinching. Believe what you like, but my family controls over 40 major trade routes, 5 planetary colonies, and a fleet that rivals some military armadas. If the wrong people found out I was still alive, entire star systems would move to secure me. Jake stared at her, trying to process the weight of that. And yet, somehow, you ended up in a gambling den on Zeta Prime, being handed off like a bad bet. She exhaled, her expression darkening. Because I was supposed to be dead. That caught his attention. Go on, he said, his voice quieter now. Seyla's fingers curled against the armrest. My family was betrayed. A faction within our house saw an opportunity to seize power, and they took it. My ship was ambushed, my guards slaughtered. The explosion should have killed me. Jake raised an eyebrow. Should have. She nodded. I survived. Barely. But I was captured before I could reach safety. The men who found me knew who I was, but they also knew I was worth more alive than dead. I spent months being moved from one place to another, my captors trying to decide whether to ransom me or sell me to the highest bidder. Jake felt a pit form in his stomach. He'd heard of this kind of thing before. Powerful heirs disappearing, only to reappear years later as someone's pawn. He leaned back, exhaling. And Xarn got his hands on you. He was the last in a long chain of dealings, Seyla confirmed. But he was also the smartest. He knew holding on to me would eventually bring too much attention. So instead of keeping me as leverage, he did the one thing no one expected. Jake smirked. Handed you off to some broke human trader. Precisely. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. Son of a... He played me. He knew those guys were coming. That's why he gave you away so easily. The moment you stepped off his hands, his problem became mine. Seyla inclined her head. It would seem so. Jake clenched his jaw. He hated being manipulated. And now, because of one bad gamble, he was tangled up in something way bigger than he had ever wanted. All right, he said finally. Say I believe you. Say you're some missing heiress. What's the play here? Because I can tell you right now, I didn't sign up for a galactic civil war. Seyla's gaze didn't waver. My play is survival. And if you help me get back to my family, you'll be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. Jake snorted. I've heard that one before. She didn't flinch. This is not a bluff. My family's wealth is vast, and their gratitude is not given lightly. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Let's assume I'm interested. Where exactly is your family? Seyla hesitated, just for a second. Jake caught it. You don't know, do you? Her jaw tightened slightly. I know where they were before the attack. But if my uncle was behind the coup, then he would have moved them to a secure location. Jake swore under his breath. So let me get this straight. We're flying blind. We've got assassins on our tail. And you're expecting me to help you waltz back into the most dangerous power struggle in the galaxy. Seyla gave him a small, unreadable smile. You do owe me, after all. Jake let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Before he could say anything else, the ship's proximity alarm blared again. Jake snapped to attention, his hands flying over the controls. What now? Seyla leaned over, her expression sharp as she read the incoming data. Another ship, she murmured, but not one of the assassins. Jake narrowed his eyes at the screen. The signal was encrypted, but whoever it was, they weren't hiding. Then, suddenly, the comms crackled to life. A deep, heavily modulated voice filled the cockpit. Vagabond, you are carrying a high-priority target. You will lower your shields and prepare for immediate boarding. Non-compliance will be met with lethal force. Jake gritted his teeth. Oh, for the love off. Seyla's hand was already hovering over the weapons console. More assassins. Jake shook his head, studying the signal. No, the kill teams had been subtle. Whoever this was wasn't hiding at all. His stomach turned. This wasn't an assassin team. This was a battleship. And they weren't just after Seyla. They were here for both of them. The Vagabond shuddered as a proximity alarm blared across the cockpit, red warning lights flashing against the dim interior. Jake's hands flew over the controls, pulling up a full scan of the approaching vessel. The data flickered onto the screen, and his stomach twisted. It was not an assassin ship. This was something worse. The vessel was large, too large for a simple bounty hunter. Its sleek, black hull reflected the distant starlight, a Velorian war cruiser if Jake had ever seen one. It was built for siege warfare, bristling with high-powered turrets, advanced shielding, and, most concerning of all, a tractor beam already locking onto their position. Jake swore under his breath. "This isn't another hit squad," he muttered. "This is military." Seyla's violet eyes were locked on the screen, her expression unreadable. But Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. "They found us faster than I expected," she admitted. Jake shot her a glare. "Yeah, no kidding. You want to tell me if these guys are friends or another batch of people who want you dead?" Seyla didn't look at him. "I don't know." That wasn't reassuring. The comms crackled again, and the same deep, modulated voice filled the cockpit. "Vagabond, you are harboring a high-priority target. Lower your shields and prepare for immediate boarding. Non-compliance will be met with lethal force." Jake exhaled sharply. "Yeah, that's not happening." He yanked the controls, sending the Vagabond into a hard dive, breaking out of the tractor beam's initial lock. The ship's thrusters flared, engines roaring as they accelerated toward open space. But the warship wasn't just watching anymore. A bright flash erupted from the cruiser's underside, and Jake barely had time to react before a blast of ion energy streaked toward them. "Hold on," he yelled. The blast clipped their rear thrusters, sending the ship into a violent spin. The cockpit lurched, and Seyla grabbed onto the edge of the console as the artificial gravity struggled to compensate. "Shields down to 30%, she reported. "Yeah, I noticed." Jake snapped, gripping the controls. He wrestled the ship back into stability, but the cruiser was already repositioning. "Who are they?" he asked again, his voice tense. Seyla's fingers moved swiftly across the console, pulling up the ship's transponder ID. When the data loaded, Jake saw her eyes widen for the first time. It was a Velorian royal warship. She sat back slightly, exhaling. "That ship belongs to my family." Jake blinked. "Excuse me?" "My father's personal fleet," she said quietly. "That ship is one of them." Jake stared at her. "Then why the hell are they shooting at us?" Seyla's jaw tightened. "Because they don't know it's me." The realization hit like a freight train. Of course they didn't. The galaxy thought she was dead. And now, from their perspective, they were tracking an unknown freighter, a ship that had just escaped an assassination attempt and was now fleeing from them at high speed. Jake groaned, gripping the controls. "All right, great. So either they think I kidnapped you, or they think I'm working for the people who actually tried to kill you." Seyla didn't argue. Jake swore under his breath, eyes flicking over the scanners. "I'm guessing you don't have a secret handshake that proves your royalty." She hesitated. There might be a way. Well, now would be a great time. Seyla's hands moved rapidly across the panel, inputting a Velorian priority code, one that only a member of the ruling house would have. The system beeped in confirmation, sending the signal directly to the warship. Jake held his breath. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the comms crackled again, but this time, the voice was different. It was still modulated, but there was an edge of something new. Recognition. Unknown vessel, you have transmitted a Velorian priority code. State your identity. Seyla pressed the comm button. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of authority. This is Seyla Vey'Rath Velorian, rightful heir to House Velorian. You are firing upon the wrong ship. Silence. Jake clenched his jaw, fingers hovering over the thruster controls in case this didn't work. Then, after what felt like forever, the warship powered down its weapons. The targeting markers on the scanner disappeared. A new voice came through the comms. This time, it was not filtered. Lady Seyla. Jake barely had time to register the shock in the man's tone before Seyla responded smoothly. Yes, Captain. I trust you're not planning on shooting me again. The captain's voice wavered. My lady, we were informed you were dead. Clearly, she said dryly. There was a sharp inhale on the other end. We must bring you aboard immediately. The Empire has been in chaos since your disappearance. Your uncle. Seyla's expression darkened. I assume he's taken full control. The captain hesitated. Your father's forces have been pushed back. He's declared himself regent, but the council has not fully recognized him. If you return, it will change everything. Jake shifted in his seat. There it was. This wasn't just a matter of bringing Seyla home. This was a power struggle, a war. And now he was in the middle of it. Seyla exhaled, sitting straighter. Understood. We will dock shortly. The comms cut off. Jake turned to her, his voice edged with frustration. So that's it. We're just walking onto that warship like nothing happened. Seyla met his gaze. It's the best option we have. You said you wanted an easy way out of this. Jake frowned. He did say that, but something didn't sit right. Yeah, but I'm guessing your uncle's not gonna be thrilled to hear you're alive, he pointed out. And if he's in power, how do we know we're not walking into another assassination attempt? Seyla didn't answer immediately, but when she did, her voice was calm. If my uncle has already solidified his rule, he'll want me dead before I can challenge him. Jake raised an eyebrow. So we're walking into a trap. She nodded once. Most likely. Jake let out a sharp laugh. You're insane. Seyla tilted her head slightly. I thought you wanted a drink. Jake shook his head, muttering a curse under his breath. I wanted a quiet drink, not a political coup. Seyla's lips curved into a faint smile. Too late. Jake groaned, rubbing a hand down his face. Fine. But when this goes sideways, I just want it on record that I told you so. Seyla simply stood, adjusting the folds of her cloak. Duly noted. The vagabond drifted closer to the massive Velorian warship, its docking bay already opening. As they approached, Jake had the sinking feeling that this was about to get a lot worse before it got better. And something told him that walking away was no longer an option. As the vagabond approached the Velorian warship, Jake could feel the weight of what was coming pressing against his chest like a vice. This was not where he had expected to be when he woke up this morning. A few hours ago, he was just another down-on-his-luck trader with a drinking problem and a gambling debt. Now he was docking with a royal battleship alongside an heir to an empire who was supposed to be dead. Yeah, great choices, Jake. The docking clamps locked onto the vagabond, and a soft jolt vibrated through the ship as it settled into the warship's massive hangar. Through the viewport, Jake could see a squad of heavily armored guards waiting for them. Their sleek silver and blue uniforms bore the Velorian royal insignia, but there was a stiffness in their stance, a tension that suggested this was far from a simple reunion. Jake glanced at Seyla, who was smoothing out her cloak with the calm patience of someone who wasn't walking straight into enemy territory. So, he muttered, what's the plan here exactly? Because I'm getting some really strong walk into the lion's den vibes. Seyla didn't look up. Simple. We make them doubt my uncle's control. If they think the rightful heir is alive, they'll hesitate before siding with him completely. Jake snorted. Yeah, and if they don't hesitate, then I'll be dead before the day is over. She said it so casually that it took Jake a second to process the sheer insanity of the situation. Before he could argue, the docking ramp hissed open, and 2 guards stepped forward immediately, their weapons lowered but ready. "Lady Seyla," one of them said, his voice uncertain, "we will escort you to Captain Vorin. He is expecting you." Seyla inclined her head. "Lead the way." Jake sighed. "I assume I get an escort too." The guards didn't even look at him. "Your presence is tolerated, human. Nothing more." Jake rolled his eyes. "Yeah, that sounds about right." As they stepped onto the warship, the difference in atmosphere was immediate. The polished black floors gleamed under the artificial lights, and the immense size of the corridors made the Vagabond feel like a junk heap in comparison. The walls hummed faintly with the power of the ship's advanced energy systems, and everything about the vessel screamed high-class military engineering. Jake had been on a lot of ships, but never one this regal. Seyla, on the other hand, walked like she belonged here. Every step she took was deliberate, measured, as if she was reminding everyone around her that she was the one who should be in charge. The guards stole glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking, their expressions shifting from confusion to something close to respect. It wasn't much, but Jake could see it happening. She was getting to them already. After a few minutes, they arrived at a massive command chamber, where a towering figure stood waiting. Captain Vorin. The man was pure Velorian military, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid with discipline. His dark blue skin and piercing silver eyes gave him the air of a man who had seen far too much war, and his sharp gaze locked onto Seyla the second she entered. For a moment, he just stared at her, as if trying to convince himself she was real. Then, finally, he spoke. "By the stars," he murmured, "you're alive." Seyla met his gaze evenly. "I am." Vorin's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something Jake recognized as calculated restraint. This man wasn't just surprised. He was thinking, processing, trying to decide what this meant for him. Jake had seen the same look in gamblers and warlords alike. Finally, Vorin exhaled. "Your uncle will not be pleased." Seyla's lips curved slightly. "I imagine not." Vorin stepped closer, studying her carefully. "There were witnesses to your death. The explosion was confirmed. Yet here you stand." "Yes," she said simply. He waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. Jake resisted the urge to smirk. She was playing him. Seyla was forcing him to fill in the blanks himself, to come up with his own explanations, his own doubts. She wasn't here to beg for loyalty. She was here to make him question everything he thought he knew. It was brilliant. Vorin's gaze flicked to Jake, his silver eyes narrowed. "And this?" Jake sighed, already hating how this was going. Jake Carter. Unlucky bastard who got tangled in all of this. Vorin didn't look impressed. "A human traitor. Why is he here?" Seyla's answer was swift. "He saved my life." The entire room shifted at those words. The guards stiffened. A few glanced at Jake, as if suddenly realizing he was more than just baggage. Even Vorin's expression faltered for a second. Jake just sighed. "You make it sound cooler than it was." "Mostly, I just didn't want to get shot." Vorin studied him for a long moment before turning back to Seyla. "This changes everything," he admitted. "If you are alive, the council will have to reconsider your uncle's claim. But you must understand, he will not let you take back control so easily." Seyla inclined her head. "I am aware." Vorin hesitated. "And if I choose to align with you, it will mean war." Seyla's expression didn't waver. "It already is." The room fell into silence. Jake could feel the weight of it. This was the moment. The turning point. Either Vorin sided with her, or she would not leave this ship alive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Vorin nodded. "Then we must move carefully," he said. "Your uncle controls most of the fleet, but there are those who remain loyal to your father. If we can contact them, The alarm cut him off. Jake swore, "I swear, if one more person tries to kill us today." A voice rang through the ship's speakers. "This is Regent Darius Velorian. The traitor Seyla is aboard this vessel. Detain her immediately, or you will share in her fate." Jake's blood went cold. Seyla stilled, her expression unreadable. Voren's face darkened. The entire room tensed, guards gripping their weapons, waiting for his decision. Jake could feel it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Then, Voren stepped forward. He turned to his men, his silver eyes hard with resolve. "You heard nothing," he said. "Lady Seyla was never here." The guards hesitated only a second before nodding, their backs straightening in silent agreement. Voren turned back to Seyla. "We need to get you off this ship. Now." Jake let out a slow breath. "Oh, now we're running. Great." Seyla glanced at him, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "I thought you liked excitement." Jake groaned, already moving. "I hate everything about today." Voren motioned to his officers. "Prepare an escape route. If the Regent's forces arrive before we leave, we will be outgunned." Seyla straightened. "Then let's not waste time." Jake sighed. "You know, I was gonna spend today drinking in a bar. Just saying." Seyla smirked. "Then you should have played your cards better." Jake rolled his eyes, following her toward the exit. He had a feeling this was only going to get worse. The ship lurched beneath them as alarms screamed through the corridors. The Velorian warship was no longer a safe haven. It was a battlefield waiting to erupt. Regent Darius Velorian's forces were closing in, and if Seyla and Jake didn't move fast, they wouldn't be leaving this ship alive. Jake sprinted after Seyla and Voren, his pulse hammering. Voren had made his choice. By refusing to hand Seyla over, he had effectively declared war against the Regent. There was no going back now. "Where's our exit?" Jake shouted over the blaring alarms. Voren's expression was grim. "Docking Bay 4. I have a stealth cruiser prepped for emergency extractions, but we need to get there before the Regent's men block us in." Jake groaned. "Fantastic. Nothing like running for our lives to really tie this whole day together." Seyla moved with precise, controlled urgency. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't scared. She was focused. Jake wasn't sure whether to be impressed or concerned. The corridors stretched ahead of them, sleek, polished Velorian architecture now flashing with emergency red lighting. As they rounded a corner, the sound of heavy boots thundered from the opposite end of the hall. Voren swore, "Guards, move." A squad of Regent-loyal soldiers appeared, their plasma rifles raised. Jake barely had time to register the order before the first shot rang out. Voren and his men returned fire immediately, blue streaks of plasma cutting through the air. Seyla moved before Jake could even blink, spinning to the side, avoiding the crossfire with unnatural precision. Jake, he ducked behind a nearby column, yanking his pistol free. "Oh, this is just perfect." Seyla snapped off a precise shot, hitting one of the soldiers in the knee. He collapsed with a cry, his weapon clattering to the floor. Jake took aim and fired. His shot clipped another soldier's shoulder, sending him staggering back. Voren's forces pushed forward, cutting through the ambush with ruthless efficiency. Within moments, the corridor fell silent, smoke curling from the air. Voren reloaded his weapon and gestured forward. "Move. We don't have time for another firefight." Jake exhaled, shoving his pistol back into its holster. "Yeah, let's avoid those. Ha." They ran. The docking bay loomed ahead, the entrance doors already unlocking as Voren's men secured their escape. A sleek Velorian stealth cruiser sat waiting on the platform, its engines primed and ready. They were almost there. Then, another alarm blared. Jake turned sharply toward the sound. The opposite hangar doors hissed open, and a new squad of heavily armed enforcers stepped through. Jake cursed. "Oh, come on." These men were different. They weren't just soldiers. They wore Regent-issued armor, sleek black plating with enhanced tactical visors. These weren't grunts. They were elite enforcers. Seyla recognized them immediately. Her jaw tightened. He sent his best. One of the enforcers stepped forward, his voice calm, controlled. "Lady Seyla," he said, "you will surrender now." Jake glanced at Seyla. "I'm guessing that's not happening." She didn't even dignify that with a response. Instead, she raised her weapon. The enforcers opened fire. Everything exploded into chaos. Jake dived behind a crate as blue plasma bolts ripped through the air. The enforcers weren't just strong, they were coordinated. Each movement was calculated, covering angles, cutting off escape routes. Velorian shouted orders, his men holding the line as best they could. Seyla moved like a storm. Every shot she fired hit its mark, every movement precise, every step a calculated strike. Jake knew how to fight. But this was something else. He took cover behind a fallen guard, grabbing a discarded shock grenade. Then, without hesitation, he hurled it toward the enforcers. The device detonated midair, sending a pulse of electric energy through their visors. They staggered, blinded for just a second. It was enough. Velorian's men pushed forward, gunning them down before they could recover. The last enforcer collapsed with a final shot to the chest, his weapon clattering to the floor. For a second, everything was silent. Then Seyla turned. "We have to go. Now." No one argued. They sprinted onto the stealth cruiser, the doors sealing shut behind them as Velorian rushed to the cockpit. Jake collapsed into his seat, exhaling sharply. "Well," he muttered, "that was terrible." Seyla sat across from him, adjusting her cloak. "We're not out yet." Jake groaned. "Of course we're not." The ship rumbled beneath them, engines flaring as Velorian pulled them into open space. Jake leaned back, rubbing a hand down his face. "So, just to recap, we escaped an assassination, pissed off a warlord, ran into a kill squad, almost got vaporized, and now we're officially fugitives from the ruling government." Seyla nodded. "That sounds about right." Jake let out a sharp laugh. "Fantastic. Just fantastic." Velorian's voice came over the intercom. "We're clear, setting course for the Outer Rim. We'll need allies before we make our next move." Jake frowned. "Next move." Seyla's expression hardened. "Darius won't stop hunting me. And if I'm to reclaim what's mine, I need to gather those still loyal to my father." Jake sighed. "So we're building a rebellion now. That's great. That's exactly how I wanted my life to go." Seyla's lips curled into a slight smile. "You could still walk away." Jake stared at her. Then he laughed, shaking his head. Not a chance. He was in this now. And something told him this was just the beginning.